Tardigrades.
Tardigrades have been found everywhere in Earth's biosphere, from mountaintops to the deep sea and mud volcanoes, and from tropical rainforests to the Antarctic. But are best known for their love of bizarre hats such as the specimen before us. Let us explore together how this tardigrade got his hat, and as always timestamps are below.
For this project, I started in Blender with a cube and a cylinder. Adding loop cuts and extrusions, I got it to the basic form you see here. After this, I exported it as an OBJ file into ZBrush, where I did further sculpting and adding detail and texture. After I was happy with the form, I brought it back into Blender for final edits and exporting as a STL for printing. If you'd like to see more about how I sculpted this in Blender and ZBrush, comment below and I can add a second video on how this was done. I'd love to share this information, but I don't want to make this video too long. Okay, so we have the tardigrade here. He has been sanded and primed, his hat comes off. I'm really happy with the sanding. There's still a couple lines in it, and a couple little rough spots, but I'm going to go ahead and paint him anyway. I think he's going to turn out fine with the paint as thick as I'm going to put on in some of these areas, and then we're going to go ahead and have a gloss coat underneath. I think it should be fine. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on him. I think what we're going to do is first just do airbrush with some highlights and lowlights, and then do a little bit of base coat on it. And then after that, we're going to hand brush paint everything else. So let's get started. So I've gone ahead and added a square in the top left corner of what color I'm using. It's not always obvious what color's inside the paint cup. So if you see what I'm doing here, we're going ahead and just spraying in what's kind of the top of the model. Anywhere light would hit, just to give it a lighter area. It's not necessarily like every spot, but we're just kind of putting down a base coat for these areas. So you don't need to be super precise. A lot of this is going to get covered. In some ways, this is almost just a road map. So now we're switching down to purple, and you can see I've angled it up, so that way I'm just kind of hitting the bottom parts of these areas. Right there, I just went ahead and accidentally banged the back part of the model. And we're going to see what this does later on here in a second. And again, I'm just putting these into the shadows, just kind of where they would be. Doesn't have to be super precise again, this is just a road map. Right there, you can see now I've got a mark on the back. That's because I did not have a towel down first. So now that I've switched to red, I'm starting to cover some of the stuff up. And it's really important to stress here that all these paints are translucent. Now, if you don't know what translucent means, think of transparent like a window. You can see through it. And then you've got opaque, like the wall next to the window. Translucent is kind of halfway between the two. Think of it more like a tinted window on a car. You can see through it, but it kind of gives it some color. Well, these are all translucent paints, which means some of these yellows and purples are going to shine through those reds and be able to give it that depth of color. And I'm using a lot of really thin layers here. So none of the layers I ever put on are enough for the entire area that it's at. They're always just building up. And these are more broad stroke areas at this point. I'm not really doing any of the detail work here. It's just kind of knocking in those shadows, knocking in those highlights, and that kind of stuff. Again, I've switched back to purple here, and I'm just kind of putting more heavy shadows in. I'm just kind of, like I said, building these in. So right here, I'm doing what's called noodling. They're kind of like figure eights, and I'm just putting them into random spots on the back just to give it some modeling and some texture to that red. Because no animal that you can see through its skin like this would be, or in my imagination, would be a solid color. So this would kind of give it maybe there's a little bit of skin texture and a little bit of muscle texture and that kind of stuff. And then again, going back in and putting more of those shadows back in. Now at this point, I'm going to start trying to use more and more precise amounts of paint just to give it a little bit more detail. Now from time to time you'll see me take my airbrush off the screen. That's because I didn't mix these paints 100% correct and they're starting to clog slightly in my brush. Okay, now we're coming back in with the red and we're just kind of masking out a lot of these areas that didn't have enough coats on them already. So now we're just going to go ahead and put a really quick, just a red coat over everything, just as a, just to kind of pull everything together. Just real thin. Now this color isn't just blotting out all the other colors we have there. It's just kind of merging them together a little, tying them together. And then we're going to come in here and we're going to do a little bit of lightening to his face, just because I think it's a little bit too dark. Again, this white is also translucent. I've mixed it with some water. I'm not trying to blot out the red. I'm just trying to kind of put a little bit of a base coat down so we can add some lighter areas to the model. I'm also starting to use the white now on the underbelly to go ahead and start cleaning up some of the overspray from the back with that red. You don't want to clean all of it up because you want a little bit of transition there, but I'm going to clean up a majority of it. Alright, so now I've gone ahead and added a little bit of yellow on top, and that's going to be the highlight color here. And so since we're doing that now over those areas that were white, it's really going to allow them to pop. So for the underbelly, I'm going ahead and doing the shadows first of just the general areas. So the under the arms, in those creases where the arms, kind of the armpit areas, maybe the shoulder folds as well, pulling that in since it's the same color we used in the back anyway. The underside of the face. And now I'm coming in and I'm doing all those folds that I added inside of the body itself. So the joint folds is what's coming up next. Now again, I'm just kind of like using those joint folds as kind of like my roadmap. I'm putting those in first, and then I'm slowly adding more and more color little by little to the rest of it till it becomes very purple. But we're going to do a white wash almost over it with the airbrush afterward, and that'll even it out. Okay, so I really like the way this guy turned out so far. I'm seeing some issues that where I couldn't quite get the stuff in I want, kind of like toward the edges here and here. It's not quite as sharp as I'd like, and then some of the details in this area here. So I'm going to go ahead in with an actual brush and just kind of add in a little bit of like hard line detail in here, but overall I think he's almost done. I might do a slight touch-up pass to some of the spots on him, but I think he's done. I'm just waiting for his hat now at this point. So I'm using the same techniques I used earlier with the airbrush paint. So it's thinned out, it's a little bit watery, and I'm going to water it down even further a little bit here in a second. I'm not going to show me doing all 8 arms here, just a couple of them, just so that we get an idea of what's going on. And I'm using a mix of purple and red here, just so it feathers nicely. And these are not expensive brushes, these are just something I got at Michael's. Same with the paints, most of these are basic paints from Michael's, the brand name. I don't usually spend a lot of money on paints. So now we're putting down the base coat of brown on the hat. Nothing special about this, just kind of looking like a nice leather color to me. I've also started wearing gloves. So now I'm putting in the shadows here, and I'm having a little bit of problems again with clogging, so you can see I put a little bit too much down sometimes, but it shouldn't be an issue at the end. And again, I'm doing that noodling in a lot of these areas just to kind of give it some texture. A lot of the same techniques we used on the Tardigrade body we're going to be using on the hat as well. Again, this is really only using 3 colors, just like the Tardigrade body did. It's just 3 different colors this time. And we also have a new studio here that I'm using. So this is a new area for filming and new cameras. So hopefully we'll get this better next time. Alright, so now I'm using cheesecloth, and that's going to go ahead and allow a texture pattern of like maybe leather or like cloth. It doesn't show up really well on camera here, but in the reveal you'll be able to see it in a lot more detail. The idea is that you're going to use, you know, if it's a dark area, you'll use a lighter. If it's a lighter area, you'll use darker. So. Alright, so now I'm just using washes. So I basically really diluted the paint a lot at this point, and I'm just kind of putting it in to show off shadows for the brim. And you can see here in the top where I've used some of that technique we just used with the cheesecloth for a lot of the areas on here, just to kind of give it some texture and stuff. And there I put too much on and I'm trying to get it off. So you see, even I make mistakes. And this is just dry brushing at this point. Maybe a little bit too much paint on this, but not too terribly much. Dry brushing is basically when you start painting with almost no paint on your brush, and you're just kind of like rubbing what's left onto there. And it can give you a nice transition a lot of times. Or if you have too much paint, it makes these weird streaks. Okay, for the stitches here, I'm using white, and it's a little bit diluted, and I'm just not putting a lot on. I want as much control as possible, so I don't mind having almost no paint in my brush. I'd much rather do multiple passes and be a little more precise about it. And you can also see more of that cheesecloth texture there at the top left side. And this is the same stitching technique I used for all the stitching on the hats. And here he is all done, ready to go out for a night on the town. I really hope you enjoyed watching this. I really enjoyed making him, and it was a lot of fun. And probably one of my favorite paints I've done so far. I've learned a lot, and I'm really enjoying my new paint studio. As always, the files are down below. So go ahead and download them from Thingiverse. Leave me a like there. Share your builds when you make them there as well. And just have fun. If you know of somebody that might like this, why don't you go ahead and send them the video? Who knows, maybe they'll make you one. I'm also going to try to include links below if you don't have a 3D printer and you just want to buy the model at some place that will print that for you. And if you're not subscribed, now is a great time to do it. You made it all the way to the end of the video, you might as well. So hit that like button on the way out, and I will see you next time. And enjoy your tardigrade.